In the last presentation, I spent some time introducing Augustine's argument for the existence of God. His argument, as mentioned before, is not really designed to show that God exists in the sense that showing that God exists to those who have no awareness of God at all. To the contrary, Augustine thinks that everyone already has the light of God's existence already present in their mind and in their experience. The problem is they're just not looking at their experience in the right way. If we shift our attention, just like in the room that I'm in, if I were to ask someone, what do you see in the room, they would say various different things. Probably not, I see light. But light is the very reason why they can see. It's the precondition for sight. The same thing with the existence of God for St. Augustine. The existence of God is the very presupposition of the human experience or desire for truth and beauty and goodness and love and all of those things. Now, in our prior presentation, we talked a little bit about the foundations of his argument, which began by looking outward at the world, only to find that God is not there as one of those objects of human experience. That's not to say that Augustine doesn't think that the world around us speaks to us of God. He certainly does think that the world speaks to us of God, but he does not believe that God may be found in the world like a material object, like a physical thing. And so then what he does is he turns his attention inward to the soul. And the reason why he turns his attention inward is because the human mind is higher than any of those objects that I see out in the world. I see material things, I see existing beings, I see living things, and I see animal things, but all of those are inferior to what's going on within my mind right now. As I'm seeking after the truth of things, I'm asking the question, does God exist, or is there any purpose to life, or is there such a thing as real truth? As I ask myself those questions, I'm engaging in an activity that the rest of the beings in this world are incapable of carrying out, with, of course, the exception of other human minds. But that's precisely the point, is that the human mind is not accessible just through the senses. What I experience are material objects or material beings or biological beings. And as I experience those things, I don't find God as one of those objects. But what I do find is by turning inward within the soul, I find a kind of activity that is greater than anything that I see out in the world. The problem is, as I look, or one of the issues is that as I look at the contents of my mind, I find remarkable things that I can't find as such out in the sensory world. Especially among these, we find things like the most basic principles of logic or reasoning. I find the principles of, let's say, mathematical reasoning within the mind. I discover objects that are seemingly entirely abstracted away from the world. I've left behind the world of material things, and I'm carrying on within my mind activities, like in mathematics, for example, or geometry. I'm carrying on activities in my mind that give to me a kind of intellectual certitude and confidence that rises above or goes beyond my sensory experience of a changing world. For example, if I had let's say a chalkboard or a dry eraser board in front of the camera now, and I were to draw a picture of a triangle, and I were to ask certain questions about the triangle. If I were to ask, where is the triangle, you would say, well, it's right there on the board. If I were to ask you, what color is the triangle, you would be able to tell me the color, whatever the color of the board is, or the ink that I've used. If I were to ask you, how long has the triangle been there, you would say, well, as long as since you just drew it, a few minutes ago or a few seconds ago. If I were to ask you, what is the sum total of the interior angles of that triangle? Often students will be a little bit, they'll take a little pause at that point because they want to say it's 180 degrees, that the interior angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees. But if you think a little bit more about it, the object that I've drawn on the board is not a perfect triangle. It's a representation of one, perhaps, one that a geometry teacher might talk about. But the object that I've drawn is not going to be perfect in its angles and in its lines. And so a person thinking about it might say, well, we'd have to measure it and see what the interior angles are. But we could answer the question. If I ask, how long will that triangle be there? And you'll say, well, as long as you leave it there. If we erase it, or if something happens, or if the sun dies out, or a meteor hits us, or whatever, then obviously the object will be changed fundamentally, and the triangle will no longer exist like that. But now if we shift our attention from the triangle that I drew on that board that you're imagining now, If we shift our attention from that triangle that I drew on the board to a triangle, let's say, that we talk about in geometry. If I ask the question, how big is a geometrical triangle? You would probably pause at that question and say, well, how big do you want it to be? In other words, the geometrical notion of triangularity includes an infinite range of possible sizes. If I were to ask you, what's it made of? What is the triangle made of? With the one that I drew on the board, you could say, well, it's made of ink and it's made of plastic or whatever the substance is that I've written on. If I ask about a geometrical triangle, what is it made of? That's a more difficult question because it's not really made of anything so far as material stuff is concerned. Geometrical triangles are made up of lines, 3 lines that intersect so as to form 3 interior angles. But when you look a little more carefully at that triangle and you think about those lines and you ask, well, what are those lines made up of? And you say, well, they're made up of points. Well, those points are not made up of any matter or substance at all. They are simply locations on a plane. And so if we think about this endless series of locations that intersect one another so as to form 3 interior angles, as we think about in the context of geometry, when we think about that kind of object, it becomes very difficult to ask, well, what's it made of? Well, it's made up of mind. It's made up of thought. It's made up of rationality or reason. If I ask, where is it? That's another difficult question to answer. It's in my mind. I'm thinking about it, but it could be in your mind too. You can think about it, and people on the other side of the world might be thinking about one. In fact, there probably are countless people who are thinking about the geometrical notion of triangularity right now, and that object can be present anywhere one thinks about it, whereas the object that I drew on the board, it's spatially defined by one particular location. If I ask, well, what's the sum total of the interior angles of the triangle? And we're thinking here about a flat surface. Obviously, if we curve the surface, it makes the properties different. But if we're talking about a flat surface, the interior angles of the triangle will be equal to 180 degrees, or half the degrees of a circle. And it's relatively easy to prove that geometrically, to show that logically the triangle must have interior angles that equal 180 degrees, or half the degrees of a circle. And so at this point, what we're seeing is that the object that I'm thinking about in my mind as I'm doing geometry is a very different kind of object than the one that I draw on the board. The one that I draw on the board is particular, it's individual, it's spatially defined, it's limited by time. It came to exist at a certain point and presumably will pass out of existence. But when I talk about geometrical triangularity, we're talking about a mental object, a logical object, and it has certain necessary properties about it and attributes. It has a kind of universality about it in the sense that it's not restricted by matter to one particular size or to one particular location. It seems to be timeless insofar as you can't think of a moment where it had to come to exist. It's not like the object that I draw, where it comes to exist when I draw it or when I use ink and make a picture of it. With respect to the geometrical notion of triangularity, there is no point at which we say, oh, it started to exist then, that triangles have interior angles that equal 180 degrees or whatever. It doesn't start to exist. It has properties that are so essential and necessary, and they don't depend upon my mind. I don't make it to be the case that the interior angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees or half the degrees of a circle. I don't make that to be true by thinking it. I discover it to be true through a process of reasoning about the object. So if it's the case that I discover these things to be true, and they're not dependent on my mind, for example, that the triangle has interior angles that equal 180 degrees was true 1,000 years ago, it was true 2,000 years ago, it was true 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. And therefore, when I came to see it, when my mind discovered it, I didn't constitute it as true or cause it to be true by thinking about it. It was true already. My mind just came to see it. So here's Augustine's point. If my mind comes to see this truth, but that this truth is a timeless one, it is not dependent on time and it's not dependent on space, if that's true and my mind discovers that it is true, then it must be that this mental object that I'm discovering through a process of reasoning must be an object that exists in a mental realm or in an intellectual realm, because that's where thoughts exist, not in a material realm. It's not a material object. So if the geometrical notion of triangularity and its qualities or attributes are not dependent on my mind, And I don't constitute them as true by thinking them, nor does any other human mind constitute them as true by thinking them. We discover that they are true. If that's the case, then it must be that mind, the necessary truths of logic and reason, is something that exists beyond me or above me, that it exists timelessly, it exists eternally, it exists without restriction of time and space, that it's not the kind of reality that can be dependent on changing material circumstances, but instead it's a mental reality or an intellectual reality that has always existed. It has no beginning to its existence. If you see this line of reasoning, and I know I'm throwing out a lot of things fast, but if you see this line of reasoning, what Augustine has done is he's looked out at the world and he's seen that God is not out there as an object of sight or of hearing. And then he works his way into his own soul by seeing that the things outside of him are all under him in the sense of a hierarchy of greater and lesser beings. So he sees that the world outside of him is less than him. He turns within his soul to discover something higher than the lower, but then he discovers within his own soul, by reflecting on the objects that he finds there, that he too is dependent on a higher reality, a higher mind that he is participating in, or that he is open to through the activity of the mind. So that when a student learns geometry or learns logic or learns philosophical truths about goodness or truth or the very structures of reason or that sort of thing, or even science, when the scientist discovers the mathematical order of nature about him, all of these discoveries for Augustine are windows of insight into a supreme mind that governs and envelops and bathes reality with its light. So that the human mind, as it thinks of truth or thinks of what must be true, whether in mathematics or in philosophy or whatever, or science, whenever it thinks these thoughts, it is actually tapping into or participating in the mind of God, the eternal, unchanging mind that is the source and home of all that is necessarily true. So let me just review one more time, very, very quickly, because I know this is a quick series of moves, but let me throw it out to you again. First, we look outside. God is not there as an object of the sensory world, because those are finite, temporary, material objects that change. That's not what God is. So then I turn my attention within the soul, and I find within myself a light shining into my mind that leads me to a higher reality, or something above myself. And I can see that most directly by seeing how my mind discovers truths that do not depend upon my mind, but that are mental truths. And that leads me to a mind that is their proper home and source from which they have come. So to conclude, Augustine's argument for God's existence is an argument that leads us to the discovery of an eternal, unchanging, timeless mind that is the source of all that is true, and that ultimately shines upon our mind, enabling us to discover what is necessarily true, and it is the source of that which enables us to rise above all of the lower animals and the lower plants and so on. It is the light of the mind of God, the eternal, the necessary truths that the mind is capable of discovering, that is tapping into God and makes us to rise above the lower. So that any time a human being engages in rational reflection, even when they disagree with the belief in God, they are still, on a certain level, participating in the light that comes from God that enables them to have this confidence that as they search for truth, or as they search for a true understanding of the world, they are actually borrowing from or using the light of the eternal reason that they are using to help them arrive at a conclusion about what is reality, what is true about reality, and so on. So the existence of God, for Augustine, is absolutely crucial to all reasoning, whether that be atheistic reasoning or theistic reasoning. The difference is that the atheist does not acknowledge or doesn't see or acknowledge the source of the light by which he makes the determinations that certain things are true or false with respect to all of reality. Again, I know that this is an abstract series of thoughts, and a challenging series of thoughts, largely because Augustine's reasoning is not very well known, but this is the essence of it. So more to come, perhaps.